Time rhymes. April 11th, 2026, the bill that arrived in silver that was no longer there. The bill that arrived in silver that was no longer there. How a war in Korea bankrupted an empire that won it, and what the Strait of Hormuz owes to a dead tax reformer. The cold, open Beijing, 1597, the Wanli Emperor sits in the Forbidden City, reading a dispatch from his generals in Korea. The news is good. Japanese forces are retreating. Victory is close. Then a second scroll arrives, this one from the Ministry of Revenue. The northeastern garrison at Liaodong has not been paid in 4 months. The soldiers are selling their armor for rice. The emperor, according to court records, weeps. He has won a war. He just cannot afford it. The historical story. The roots of the catastrophe reach back a quarter century to a man who thought he was saving the empire. Zhang Zhuzheng became Grand Secretary of the Ming Court in 1572, inheriting a fiscal system so tangled it had become almost ungovernable. Taxes were collected in grain, silk, labor, and dozens of local commodities, each assessed differently in each province. Corruption thrived in the gaps. Zhang's solution was elegant, modern, and ruthless. He consolidated all tax obligations into a single medium, silver. Pay in silver or don't pay at all. The reform, known as the single whip, worked beautifully. Revenue surged. Provincial accounts became legible for the first time in generations. The empire hummed. There was one structural assumption buried inside the brilliance. The Ming dynasty did not mine much silver. The metal flowed in from Japanese mines, transiting through Korean trade networks and maritime routes before pooling in Ming provincial treasuries. Zhang had, in effect, pegged the fiscal solvency of the world's largest empire to a single commodity flowing through a single geographic corridor. He died in 1582. The system he built kept running on institutional momentum. 10 years later, Toyotomi Hideyoshi shattered the corridor. Hideyoshi, the warlord who had unified Japan after a century of civil war, launched an invasion of Korea in 1592 with 160,000 troops. His ambition was grandiose: conquer Korea, then China, then perhaps India. His actual target was Korean territory. He was not thinking about silver flows, trade routes, or Ming tax policy. He was thinking about glory. The side effects were immediate and devastating. Japanese silver output redirected toward military logistics. Korean intermediary trade routes collapsed. The bullion pipeline into Ming China constricted like a pinched artery. The Wanli Emperor, recognizing that a Japanese-controlled Korea would threaten China's northern frontier, committed Ming forces to the peninsula. An initial deployment of roughly 40,000 troops in 1593, growing over the course of the war to a total of perhaps 167,000 to 220,000 soldiers, depending on the source. The intervention succeeded on its own terms. After Hideyoshi's death in 1598, Japanese forces withdrew. Korea survived. The Ming had won, but winning cost approximately 26 million taels of silver, roughly 10 billion in today's purchasing power. The treasury that Zhang Zhuzheng had spent a decade filling was gutted in 6 years of fighting. What followed was not a single crisis, but a slow, compounding rot. By the early 1600s, provincial treasuries were defaulting on military payroll. Soldiers stationed along the Liaodong frontier, the border facing the rising Manchu Confederation, went months without wages. Some deserted, some mutinied, some sold their weapons. The garrisons that were supposed to hold the empire's northern line became hollow shells. Into this vacuum stepped Nurhaci, a Manchu chieftain of extraordinary strategic patience. He did not need to outfight the Ming, he needed to outweight them. Every year the silver crisis deepened, his relative position improved. He consolidated Manchu tribes, built an army organized around the 8 Banners system, and began probing the weakened frontier. The Ming soldiers who failed to stop the Manchu advance were not outgunned. They were unpaid. The payroll crisis traced to silver shortages caused by a war fought in Korea over territory that was not China's against an enemy that had already gone home. The fiscal wound intersected with the Little Ice Age in the 1620s and 1630s, which crushed agricultural yields and further depressed tax revenue. Famine bred peasant rebellion. The dynasty hemorrhaged from both ends, rebels from within, Manchus from without. In 1644, rebel forces under Li Zicheng breached Beijing's walls. The last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree on Coal Hill, overlooking the Forbidden City. Weeks later, the Manchu armies swept through the Great Wall, invited in by a desperate Ming general. The Qing dynasty replaced the Ming. The war that started the collapse had ended 46 years earlier. The enemy that started it, Japan, had lost. The empire that won it, Ming China, was dead. Zhang Zhuzheng's brilliant reform had turned a commodity dependency into a civilizational vulnerability. Nobody noticed until the corridor broke. The echo, in April 2026, a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran holds over the Strait of Hormuz, the corridor through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply transits daily. The ceasefire followed 40 days of US-Israeli strikes on Iran and Iran's closure of the strait, a conflict that had begun in late February 2026. CBS News reports that Trump has cautioned Iran against charging tolls through the strait, while CNBC tracks stock futures that remain little changed as traders monitor the ceasefire's durability. The calm is tentative, the anxiety is structural. The parallel to Zhang Zhuzheng's Silver Corridor is not metaphorical, it is architectural. Over the past half-century, global economies built their energy logistics, shipping insurance models, airline fuel pricing, and petrochemical supply chains around the assumption that Hormuz stays open. That assumption was not reckless, it was rational, the way the single whip reform was rational. Hormuz has stayed open through the Iran-Iraq War, 2 Gulf Wars, and decades of saber-rattling. Rational assumptions, however, have a way of hardening into invisible dependencies. Supporters of the current posture argue that the ceasefire, however fragile, demonstrates that deterrence works and that the economic disruption has been contained. Oil prices, while elevated, have not spiked to the catastrophic levels some analysts predicted. Markets, as CNBC notes, are holding steady. The system is bending, not breaking. Critics counter that the real damage is not in the headline oil price but in the secondary effects. Repriced shipping insurance through the Persian Gulf, elevated jet fuel costs rippling into consumer travel, institutional borrowing costs adjusting to geopolitical risk premiums, and a general atmosphere of uncertainty that suppresses long-term capital investment. The USPS suspension of employer pension contributions reported by NewsNation reflects a cash crunch driven by multiple factors, but rising fuel and logistics costs are among them. When a postal service cannot fund its pensions, the economic aftershock of a distant conflict has reached the mailbox. Meanwhile, as the Wall Street Journal reports, the Iran situation has opened fissures within domestic politics, with Trump lashing out at MAGA critics amid an intra-party split over the conflict's scope and cost. The Ming court fractured along similar lines after the Korean intervention. Hawks argued the expense was necessary for frontier security. Fiscal conservatives warned the Treasury could not sustain it. Both were right. The debate consumed political energy that might have been spent addressing the underlying vulnerability. The Ming case does not predict what happens next. History rhymes. It does not repeat on command. But it does illuminate a specific danger that quarterly earnings reports and daily futures tracking are poorly designed to capture the long tail. The Imjin War ended in 1598. The dynasty it bankrupted fell in 1644. The economic scar outlasted the war by nearly half a century, compounding silently through systems that appeared stable until they weren't. The question the Ming case forces on 2026 is not whether the ceasefire holds this week. It is whether the dependencies exposed by the conflict will be restructured before the next disruption, or whether they will be quietly papered over the moment oil prices dip, the way Ming court officials stopped worrying about silver flows once the Korean War ended and the bullion seemed to resume. Last time they stopped worrying, the bill came due 46 years later, delivered to a dynasty that no longer existed. Sign-off empires don't collapse when the war starts. They collapse when the invoice for winning finally comes due and nobody remembers who ordered the war.